The hum of the particle accelerator vibrated through the steel floor, a low-frequency drone that rattled the glass vials on the nearby workbench. Elias stood motionless before the console, his palm hovering inches above the activation sequence. For 30 years, this room had been his entire world. He had spent those decades stripping away the layers of conventional physics, looking for the ghost in the machine. While his peers pointed their telescopes at distant galaxies, Elias kept his gaze fixed on the microscopic. He watched the monitors flicker with raw data, the readouts pulsing in sync with the cooling fans. He did not see mere subatomic particles on those screens. He saw a blueprint. He tapped the glass, and the display shifted, revealing a complex web of energy signatures that defied standard gravitational models. He breathed in the sterile air, his fingers twitching toward the final switch. The machine was ready. He had spent a lifetime preparing for this specific alignment. And now, the threshold was finally within reach. He pressed the key. The hum spiked into a high-pitched whine, and the central chamber began to glow. Elias pulled a stack of handwritten logs toward him. The paper yellowed and brittle at the edges. He ignored the monitor's rhythmic pulse to focus on a single, circled date. He traced the lines of a star chart overlaid with a human silhouette. The theory was simple in its complexity. When a child draws that first, sharp breath, the atmosphere inside the lungs matches the pressure of the cosmos outside. It is a moment of total synchronization. He tapped the desk, his finger landing on the term house. This was the gravitational imprint, the invisible anchor that pulls a life along a specific, unchangeable path. He stood up and walked to the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of white. He thought of the millions of breaths being taken at this exact second, each one locking a soul into its celestial cage. The air in the lab felt heavy, charged with the weight of these ancient, silent laws. He returned to the console, his movements slower, more deliberate. He looked at his own hands, realizing that every movement he made was merely the echo of alignment set in motion the moment he was born. Elias leaned into the glow of the primary monitor, his eyes tracing the jagged lines of the energy output. He adjusted the fine-tuning dial, his knuckles white against the dark plastic. The screen flickered, the chaotic noise of the accelerator collapsing into a singular, sharp image. He held his breath. At the center of the frame, a dense, pulsating point of light anchored the structure. Around it, smaller spheres orbited in perfect, elliptical paths. He tapped the glass, his finger hovering over the glowing core. It was not a random distribution of matter. It was a mirror. He cross-referenced the coordinates with his archived star maps, the data points aligning with mathematical precision. The proton at the heart of the cell acted as the sun, while the electrons traced the exact trajectories of planets in a distant system. He sat back, the chair scraping harshly against the concrete floor. The scale of the discovery hit him with the force of a physical blow. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the screen, feeling the hum of the machine vibrate through the glass. The realization settled into the room. Elias pushed the monitor aside, the screen's light casting long, distorted shadows across his desk. He reached for a stack of ancient, leather-bound manuscripts, their pages stiff with age. He flipped through the brittle parchment until he found the diagrams he had studied years ago. The text detailed the human frame not as a singular machine, but as a collection of 248 distinct parts. He traced the ink lines with his thumb, noting the annotations that described each limb, organ, and nerve as a vessel for its own unique intelligence. He tapped a diagram of the heart, then the lungs, then the liver. Each possessed a specific frequency, a localized consciousness. He stood and paced the small lab, his boots clicking rhythmically against the metal floor. He stopped at the center of the room, looking at his own palms. The complexity of the human form was a deliberate, layered architecture. Elias reached for the main power breaker on the control console. He needed to see what happened when the current failed. He flipped the heavy switch. The hum of the accelerator died instantly, replaced by the sharp, metallic click of cooling relays. On the monitor, the perfect solar system of the cell began to warp. The central proton, once a steady point of light, dimmed and lost its gravitational pull. The orbiting electrons lost their path, drifting outward like sparks from a dying fire. He watched the screen as the structure dissolved into static. The cohesion vanished. Without the master energy to hold the form, the parts were nothing more than scattered debris. He tapped the monitor, but the image was gone, replaced by the erratic pulse of background noise. The fragility of the form was absolute. He looked at his own hand, flexing his fingers to feel the tension of muscle and nerve. If the energy departed, this hand would be just as chaotic as the atoms on the screen. The body was a temporary vessel, a shell held together by a force that could dissipate at any moment. He stared at the dark glass of the monitor, realizing that the master energy was the only thing standing between order and total dissolution. Elias pushed his chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the concrete floor. He stood up, his gaze lingering on the cold, dormant surface of the particle accelerator one last time. For decades, he had looked outward, seeking answers in the vast, empty reaches of space. He turned his back on the machine, the hum of the cooling fans fading into the background. He walked toward the center of the room, away from the complex arrays of sensors and wires. He stopped under the harsh glow of the overhead lights and held his hands out, palms facing upward. He studied the lines etched into his skin, the map of his own existence. The accelerator was a hollow tool, a distraction from the true architecture of the universe. He closed his fingers slowly, feeling the pulse of his own blood against his skin. This was the real laboratory. The mastery he sought was not found in the collision of particles, but in the quiet, internal alignment of his own energy. He took a deep breath, grounding his feet firmly against the floor. He stopped looking for the stars. He began to look into the very center of his own being, tracing the hidden currents that held his form together. The transition was absolute. He was no longer an observer of the cosmos, but a participant in the architecture of his own life. Elias stood in the center of the room, his eyes closed, focusing on the rhythm of his own pulse. He felt the weight of his past ambitions, the ego that had driven him to build the accelerator. It was a physical pressure, a tightening in his chest that made breathing a conscious effort. He tried to clear his mind, but images of his failed experiments and lost years crowded his thoughts. This was the obstacle. The temptation to return to the machine, to seek validation in external data, pulled at his focus like a physical tether. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white, fighting the urge to turn back. He realized the truth. If he failed to shed this ego, his energy would not advance. It would be forced to return, to cycle back into the world in a new, unrefined form. The thought sent a jolt of cold through his limbs. He forced his hands to relax, opening his palms wide to release the tension. He stood firm, refusing to let the old patterns dictate his next move. The struggle was not against the machine, but against the part of himself that feared the silence. He pushed the distractions aside until the pressure in his chest began to subside. Elias stepped back to the console, his fingers hovering over the dials. He bypassed the main particle settings, rerouting the power to the antenna array. He needed to measure the aura, the surrounding energy intelligence that dictated his own brain function. He turned the sensitivity dial, his movements precise and deliberate. The monitor remained dark, a flat line of static mocking his intent. He paused, closing his eyes to center his breath, then reached out to touch the antenna directly. The metal was cold against his palm. He pushed his own energy forward, a conscious act of will. The monitor flickered. A jagged rhythmic wave pulsed across the screen, then vanished. He adjusted the frequency, his jaw tight, his pulse hammering in his throat. He held his hands steady, refusing to waver. The static cleared. A steady, luminous waveform bloomed on the display, mirroring the rhythm of his own heartbeat. It was real. The energy was not a theory. It was a tangible force, distinct and measurable. He watched the wave crest and fall, the light washing over his face. The connection was clear. He was no longer just a man in a lab. He was a convergence of light and matter, a temporary shell finally witnessing the truth of his own existence. The monitor hummed, a steady, rhythmic pulse of light that echoed the beating of his own heart. Elias watched the waveform, his breath slowing to match the frequency on the screen. He reached out and flipped the main power switch. The hum died instantly. The room plunged into a sudden, heavy silence. He did not reach to turn it back on. He stepped away from the console, his boots clicking against the cold floor, the sound sharp and final. He looked at his palms, turning them over in the dim light of the lab. The energy he had sought to measure was not trapped in the hardware. It was the force that moved his muscles, the spark that fired his neurons. He felt the weight of his physical form, a temporary container he had spent a lifetime trying to understand. He walked to the center of the room and stood still, closing his eyes. He stopped trying to force the world to conform to his theories. He simply existed, a convergence of light and matter held together by a fragile, fading tension. The fear of the end had vanished. He was ready. He stood in the center of the dark lab, waiting for the transition, waiting for the light to finally break through the shell and return to the source.